So I'm about ready to install the ground plates inside our entry panel here. But first I wanted to go through the ground system we have in place. When I had the trenches open for the water and the conduit, I went ahead and buried 3 ground rods. The reason 3 is that's all I could find locally. I was hoping to put 6 in, but 3 will do for now, and I've got it set up to where I can easily extend it, and I'm going to go ahead and add an additional 3 on the back side of the building. Probably not this fall, but next spring we'll do that. It's also tied into the ground system for the tower that's right next to the building, and that, without going back and looking at my notes, it's either 9 or 12 ground rods that I put in when I put that tower in. So it's going to be fairly well grounded. The ground rods I just put in, they're spaced 16 feet apart, and the reason for that 16-foot spacing is ground rods have a sphere of influence, and that sphere of influence is equal to the diameter of that sphere is, you take the length of the ground rod times 2, so these are 8-foot ground rods, so that's 16-foot diameter. So you'll want, from the center of the ground rod to the next ground rod, if you're using both of those are 8-foot ground rods, you'll want them spaced about 16 feet apart to get the most efficient use out of your ground system. Now if you're using 4-foot ground rods, you'll want to go with 8 feet apart. Now, the reason I don't like the galvanized ground rods is kind of a twofold reason. One, it makes me a little nervous putting copper on top of a galvanized metal like that. Even though the manufacturer of the compression fittings say it's absolutely fine, and I've installed quite a few of them that way, it still kind of bugs me to do it. I'm always worried about corrosion on those. Probably the main number one reason is driving these things. I use an electric jackhammer. I bought this thing back when I had my own two-way business. I bought that and a compression tool way back then, and I've kept them around, and it's been kind of handy for projects like this. But if you've got if these are 5/8 ground rods, if you had the 3/4 inch driver, which I do somewhere, I'm just not sure where it's at. If you have that, it'll drive these no problem. All I could find was my 5/8 driver. And using a 5/8 driver on 5/8 galvanized rod is going to be problematic because when you start driving these, the galvanizing comes off on the inside and kind of galls itself up against that bit. And those are really hard steel bits. And it will get stuck on that ground rod. I had it happen to me twice driving these in. The first time it happened, that thing got so stuck on there, it took me about 40 minutes of heating it and banging on it before I could finally get it off of there. It was quite a chore getting that off of there. The second one it got stuck on, it wasn't real bad stuck. Usually you can just tap it a few times and they'll pop off, but that one was really, really stuck. And the reason it was so stuck was it took me a while to drive that ground rod because we're in ground out here that's got a lot of rock in it. Well, it's not loose rock, it's like fractured bedrock. And that's one thing this driver works really well for, is that kind of ground. You can drive ground rods through that fractured bedrock without any problem. If you try doing that by hand with a post hole driver, it'll drive you nuts. Yeah, I mean, you'd be out here all day trying to drive one of those things. So it works really well for that type of material. Now, if you're in soil that's sandy, soft, you can just drive them with a post hole driver or a post driver. You know, the galvanized rods are probably just fine and you can get away with it without any problem. So I went with compression fittings, and that's what I've been using for quite a while. And the reason for that is, well, first let's go through the list of fittings you could use. There's the mechanical type, like an acorn nut or other types that you can put on ground rods. I strongly recommend not using those. Those things will corrode up. You cannot direct bury those. Don't ever direct bury those because you'll have to get out and clean those once in a while. Now, I've heard the argument that if I get hit by lightning, that little bit of corrosion in there, the lightning's not going to care about it. That's probably true, but for a good RF ground, you don't want that corrosion in there. And those will, no matter what, they will corrode. over time. They'll get a thin layer of oxidization on them, and they will not provide a good RF ground. So don't use them unless that's the only thing you have available to use. So probably the number one, the best choice would be CAD welding or exothermic welding. I don't have access to a mold. At work we've got them, but I know a couple guys I could go borrow one from, but I'm not super thrilled with doing it. I have had some issues in the past with exothermic welding. If you get any moisture in the mold, better watch out. They will likely explode on you. And we've had it happen twice in the past. One was completely our fault. We left the mold attached to the tower leg overnight. It just got too late in the day, left it attached, and instead of pulling it off and putting it away. So overnight it got cool and it got a little moisture in there, and we touched that thing off the next day and it exploded. It just blew that thing completely apart. Fortunately, it didn't hurt the tower leg. Now, compression fittings are probably a very close second to the exothermic welding. According to the company, of course it's a sales pitch, it's just as good as exothermic welding, which I kind of doubt whether it's quite as good, but we've put thousands of these connectors in, and I don't think we've ever had anyone, if installed properly, give us a problem. The one drawback to these is you'll probably have to go rent a crimper to do them. Most of the places that rent them are the hand-operated crimpers, which they're just fine. This battery-operated one you see me using, even the newer version of this one, they're big, they're bulky, and kind of cumbersome, especially down in trenches, where sometimes the hand-operated ones are easier to get down in there. And I think most of the hand-operated ones will put out just as much or pretty close to the same pressure as this battery-operated one. So, and I think it's about, if I remember right, it's about 6 tons of pressure it puts on a very small area and really crimps those things down tight. And we've taken some of these that were installed 15, 20 years ago and cut up, we've removed the sight, and so we cut the ground rods off, and I took them and cut those in half and looked at them thinking, I bet you there's some corrosion in here, and there was absolutely none, even after being in the weather for 20 years. So I'm a firm believer in them. They work really well. The one other drawback to these things is they're fairly expensive. Like these connectors you see for the ground rods, if you go buy them from a vendor, you're probably going to pay about $50 per connector. Now, if you watch eBay like I did, you'll find them on eBay overstock, or somebody bought, a large company bought them and they've got some left over on a project, and you'll see them sell them once in a while. If you watch carefully, you can find these, and they run, I think for this 10-pack, I paid about $50 with some shipping, I think. They weren't too bad. They were around $5-6 per connector. The only drawback was I found out that my dies would not fit these newer style connectors, so then I had to go back on eBay and find the right dies, because I went to buy them new and they're about $120 for a new set, and I thought, well, I wonder if eBay's got any, and sure enough I found some on there for about $25-30 I think is what I paid for those. And so that's the biggest drawback, is finding the availability of the crimping tool to crimp these things on. But once you got it done, they're done forever. So let's hop to getting this thing installed. I'm going to use crimps on, or compression fittings on the wires going up to this. And so let's go ahead and get this thing wrapped up. So the idea here, this is going to be probably LMR 400 or something equivalent going into the shack. So that's fairly flexible, but coming up out of this conduit from the field tower, that's LDF4. So I want to be able to bring nice bends on that LDF4. You don't want to kink that stuff. The stuff coming in from the other tower will come in through the sidewall of this and come in and connect to this plate. So I want nice sweeps, and I want a nice easy path back to ground for any lightning. Ideally, on these plates, the ground would be down here on the bottom, but this one's already exothermically welded on here, so I'm just going to connect to this with the ground wires coming up. Same with this plate down here. I'll just connect it either here or directly to this plate. we've got the ground plates installed. That was quick and easy. When I bring the ground wire up, we're going to make nice sweeping bends to connect up to these ground plates. Now, the one thing I forgot to order, and I just realized it today, was I wanted to upgrade the the lightning protection for the rotator and control wires. The ones I've got, I don't really want to reuse them. They're an older style, and they clamp at a certain voltage. They're supposed to clamp at around 55 volts. I've found that sometimes, especially with the rotator control, they clamp a little too low and they don't let the voltage get to the rotator like it should. So I want to upgrade those, and I totally forgot I was going to order new ones. So for this fall, I don't think we're going to get much lightning this fall. I think I'm going to just install my rotator cables without the lightning protection on them, because I don't want to go through the hassle with those old ones. And I'll just order new ones. Hopefully they'll come, you know, I'll get them in the next couple weeks and we can get them installed. But for the time being, we're going to install our rotator control cables without lightning protection on them. Normally you don't want to do that. That's just another easy path for lightning to get into your shack, and you want to make sure you keep the lightning out. That's one of the key ideas behind putting an entrance panel, or they make a window version that you can buy. I've seen it from a couple different companies where it's a ground plate that goes into the bottom of a window. You want to do something. Don't invite the lightning into your shack. Don't put your lightning protection inside your shack. Put it on the outside somewhere. Keep that lightning outside. If you bring it into the shack, there's really not a lot you're going to do to keep it from destroying equipment. And there's guys out there that'll say, no matter what you do, if you get a lightning strike, it'll destroy your equipment. That's a bunch of hogwash. We have hundreds of towers up on mountaintops. Very, very seldom with current grounding systems and procedures do we ever lose radio equipment on mountaintops. Back when I first started 30 years ago, we lost equipment all the time. We just didn't really know how to do it. And then we started taking grounding courses, figured out the best way to do it. And since we've implemented those new procedures and techniques, keeping the lightning outside of the building, we just really don't lose equipment. We may lose a polyphaser once in a while, and we lose a lot of antennas and feed lines once in a while, but very seldom do we ever lose a radio. I think the last time I remember us losing a radio, and this is out of, I'm just going off the top of my head, probably 500 sites here in the Pacific Northwest, all of them up on mountains. I think the last time I remember us losing an actual piece of equipment was about 5 years ago. And the building, it was a new building that had been installed, and the ground hadn't been hooked up yet. So the lightning took the tower took a lightning strike, and it did destroy that piece of equipment. But other than that, if buildings are properly grounded and you keep the lightning on the outside, you just don't lose equipment anymore. Well, we're about ready to wrap things up, but I wanted to go over these connectors and how that pole went through that conduit. The pull itself went fairly well. We pulled 4 half-inch hard lines and 5 control lines through there all at the same time. The 45 in the middle did create a little friction, extra friction as anticipated, but it wasn't all that bad. Start to finish, even pulling the rope through and setting cameras up, probably had an hour, hour and a half tied up in that project. I probably had more time getting the hard lines all laid out on the ground and all the control lines laid out so they wouldn't kink up when I pulled them in. I had probably had more time invested in that than the actual pull. Using that four-wheeler with the winch on it really saved a lot of time. I'm not really sure you could pull that by hand. Maybe if you had a real strong back and a weak mind, you might be able to do it. But the way we did it, it actually worked out pretty well. The worst part was the weather. It was only about 24, 25 degrees most of the day, 15, 20 mile an hour wind. So that was the worst part. On the next video, you'll see us putting the connectors on, getting all the jumpers in place, getting the shack back together, hopefully kind of in its final state. But before we go, I want to talk about these connectors real quick. If you decide to use these, there's all kinds of variations on these things. So if you're thinking about it, make sure first you have access to a crimp tool, that you can rent one somewhere, and that you have the right dies available. As you can see, this one came wrapped in saran wrap from eBay. 2 of them were that way. The other 8 had the factory packaging on them, all nice and sealed up. Now the reason I think these 2 came wrapped in saran wrap is, and they were listed this way, I knew they were going to come this way, is I think they opened them up and tried to use them. In fact, some of the slime in the middle of this was missing, and I think they put it on a ground rod and started to try and assemble the thing and figured out they didn't have the right die for it, so they just sold them all and ordered the other ones. Now, I pretty much ran into the same thing because I wasn't paying close enough attention when I ordered these to what die these took. So these ones here take die 998. The smaller size that fits 1/2 inch and 5/8 ground rods takes die 997. Now these only fit 5/8 and 3/4 ground rods. And that's one of the reasons I had trouble finding ground rods. I found lots of 1/2 inch ground rods around town, but only 3 5/8. I see the store now has a whole bunch of them in stock. But at the time I was looking, all I could find was 1/2 inch, and these will not fit 1/2 inch ground rods. They just won't clamp down tight enough. So the model number on these is a YGHP34C2. Now if you want the one for 1/2 inch and 5/8 ground rods, those are a YGHP29C2, I believe. So, but there's all kinds of different variations on these things. Different holes here. These are made for a number 2 wire. Well, they're made for a range of wire, but I always use a number 2 wire with these. You can get them up to like 4/0 wire. There's all kinds of variations. Go on Burndy's website and you can find a lot of information about these. And there's tons of different connectors, but there's tons of different dies too. So make sure if you order these, you've got the right dies to go with whatever connector you're planning on using. I talked about that slime in the middle. That is Penetrox E. I wiped a little bit off here on a paper towel so you could see it. This is what allows you to connect these to dissimilar metals. So that's the reason you can use these solid copper on the galvanized grounder rods without worry that you're going to have problems down the road. This stuff works wonders. And if you rub some of it off, like what's happened to this connector, you can just buy a tube of it and fill that back in. So that's the ground rod connectors. Like I said, if you're thinking about using these, double check you've got availability to the right dies before you do it. Now, here is some connectors I ordered off of eBay as well. These ones have been beaten around. A lot of the Penetrox is inside the packaging. I don't know how long these things have been beaten around. You can see, hopefully on the outside edge, there's a lot of Penetrox on the outside of that. These are kind of a C connector. These are made to crimp 2 wires together. And again, these come in a ton of variations. You can get this to crimp from like 4/0 or even larger wire down to like number 6 wire on the other side. So look on their website, pick the ones that you want. Again, a lot of these use a similar die though, but the bigger they get, they do change dies. But these, I use these all the time for connecting different wires together. And again, they're full of penetrox. I've used these to crimp to the bigger version of this. One side's a little larger. I can crimp to the cross members on a Roan 45 over to a number 2 ground wire. That works really well for grounding your tower. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to go through those connectors real quick and explain why you can use these on dissimilar metals. It's because they're filled with penetrox. And like I said, I've used them for years and never had any problems, even with the galvanized ground rods. Part of me, it still bugs me, but I do it. Okay, thanks for watching, subscribing. We'll see you on the next video. Hopefully that will be out tomorrow.
It was a cold, wild winter. You were sleeping on my shoulder. I was praying that the raging storm would stay a little longer with your